I didn't flinch when the process server handed me those papers, just calmly signed with my left hand while my right rested on the property survey that would destroy her entire empire. The Oakwood Estates HOA president thought she could sue me for living outside HOA jurisdiction while I was deployed in Ukraine. These suburban warlords built their cookie-cutter paradise on the foundation of entitlement, complete with yoga pants Karens patrolling in golf carts. What they didn't know is that I'm a military boundary specialist with a law degree from West Point. That little patch of land they claimed as theirs had been waiting 50 years for someone stupid enough to build on the wrong side of the county line. The audacity was truly something to behold until I discovered their entire HOA was built on land that didn't legally exist. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below because you're about to witness the most beautiful HOA takedown involving county survey lines, federal jurisdiction, and the sweet sound of legal paperwork shredding a corrupt empire. Let me introduce you to Alex Ranger. That's me. I'm 39 years old, a retired Army Corps boundary specialist with 3 tours in Iraq and 1 in Ukraine, where I specialized in territorial demarcation and international boundary disputes. I'm the 4th-generation owner of 17 acres of prime Virginia land just outside Charlottesville, nestled in the rolling hills where the Blue Ridge Mountains meet civilization, like an old soldier trying to blend into polite society. My great-grandfather, who we all called Colonel, bought this property back in 1948 when Charlottesville was still a college town where horseback riding trails outnumbered shopping centers by about 100 to 1. Colonel was the kind of man who believed in 3 things: accurate survey lines, the Constitution, and keeping your word. In 1971, he had the property professionally surveyed and recorded with Albemarle County. Nothing fancy, just iron pins driven deep into the earth, survey markers placed at precise coordinates, and legal documentation filed with the county clerk. Colonel always said that someday the city would try to take what was rightfully ours, but for now, it was just beautiful mountain property where we taught our kids about responsibility and land stewardship. Then came my tours in Iraq and Ukraine, where I specialized in territorial demarcation and boundary disputes. Turns out settling international border conflicts teaches you a thing or two about precision, patience, and how quickly people will try to steal your land when they think you're not looking. While I was on my 3rd deployment, Colonel passed away. The property went into a trust managed by my well-meaning but overwhelmed cousin Michael, who lives in Florida and knows about Virginia land law as I know about ballet. He hired a local property management company called Blue Ridge Property Services to handle the taxes and upkeep. The property taxes got paid automatically. But here's the thing: Michael never actually looked at the survey documentation. Big mistake. Enter our villain, Cindy Pembroke, 58 years old, president of Oakwood Estates HOA, and the kind of woman who drives a Mercedes GLC 300 and treats yoga pants like business attire. Cindy's got that particular brand of suburban aggression that Charlottesville residents perfect around age 50. You know, the kind where they'll quote the HOA bylaws while violating your constitutional rights and somehow make it sound like they're saving the neighborhood. Cindy's married to County Commissioner Harold Pembroke, which should tell you everything you need to know about how she gets things done. She's got a reputation for neighborhood enhancement initiatives, which is fancy talk for forcing out anyone who doesn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. The smell of her expensive essential oils can't quite mask the stench of hypocrisy that follows her around like a cloud of artisanal fog. I came home from deployment in April 2024, ready to finally spend some real time on Colonel's land. I drove down that familiar dirt road, past the old maple tree where I'd carved my initials as a kid, expecting to see the same rolling hills and that little farmhouse sparkling in the Virginia sun. Instead, I found surveyors, landscapers, and HOA signs scattered across my property like some kind of suburban invasion. The crunch of gravel under my boots felt different somehow, angrier. I could taste the dust and my own rising fury as I marched up to the survey crew. "Sorry, buddy," one said, not looking sorry at all. "This is Oakwood Estates property now. You're on the wrong side of the line." I called the police. Officer Jenkins showed up and explained with obvious discomfort that the HOA had filed a civil suit against me for living outside HOA jurisdiction. Apparently, they claimed my property was actually part of their development, and by living there, I was violating their bylaws. That's when Cindy appeared, riding up in her little golf cart like some kind of suburban warlord. Her voice had that sugary sweetness that immediately made me want to check my sidearm. "Your family abandoned this land, honey," she said, smiling like she was doing me a favor. "We're just putting it to good use for the community." But here's what really got my blood boiling. I discovered that her surveyors had moved the property markers that Colonel had placed in 1971. The iron pins were gone, replaced with new stakes that conveniently placed my farmhouse inside Oakwood Estates. As I stood there watching the last remnants of Colonel's survey disappear, Cindy's parting shot echoed in my ears. "You should have stayed closer to home, soldier boy." That's when I knew this wasn't just about land. It was war. I hired the first attorney I could find. Big mistake. This guy quoted me $65,000 just to respond to the lawsuit. Turns out, while I was serving my country, Cindy's husband, Harold, had pushed through an emergency zoning modification. My family's land went from independent property to HOA territory faster than you can say conflict of interest. But here's where my Army Corps training came in handy. While that overpriced lawyer was shuffling papers and billing hours, I was digging through the county records like I was hunting for IEDs. And just like in Baghdad, the devil was in the details. I found Colonel's original 1971 survey documentation, and it was beautiful. See, Colonel didn't just have the property surveyed, he worked directly with the U.S. Geological Survey for boundary verification. That meant federal oversight. And here's your first knowledge nugget. Any property surveyed with federal verification creates federal jurisdiction that local HOAs can't override, period. The metallic taste of adrenaline hit my tongue as I realized what I'd found. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was a federal case. But wait, it gets better. While I was photocopying documents at the courthouse, I stumbled across a 1935 deed restriction buried in the old records. My great-grandfather had purchased this land with a specific covenant. The property shall remain outside all municipal and HOA jurisdiction in perpetuity. These restrictions were older than the HOA, older than the city's municipal zoning codes, older than every single one of those cookie-cutter homes sitting on what should be my land. They weren't just stealing my property, they were violating a legally binding covenant that had been in place for 89 years. Meanwhile, Cindy was busy playing the victim. She organized an emergency HOA meeting about the unlawful occupant, complete with a local news crew she'd obviously tipped off in advance. I watched her on the evening news, standing in front of her perfectly manicured lawn, talking about neighborhood security. "We're just concerned about our community standards," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "That property looks abandoned, and we have families living right next door." The funny thing about local news is they love a good story, but they're not always great with follow-up research. If they'd bothered to check, they would have found that my property had been legally occupied for generations. Cindy posted on the Nextdoor app, that digital neighborhood watch where HOA presidents go to flex their petty authority. Her post warned about illegal squatters and unstable individuals in the area. She never mentioned my name, but she didn't have to. In a community that small, everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed with cherry blossoms hung heavy in the April air as I stood on my front porch each evening watching their survey crews work double shifts. They were racing to complete their fraudulent boundary markers before I could get any kind of legal injunction. Every night I counted new HOA signs. Every night the last remnants of Colonel's survey disappeared another inch. That's when I called my old Army buddy Tom Surveyor, who now works for the U.S. Geological Survey. 20 minutes on the phone with Tom taught me more about federal boundary law than 3 hours with that expensive attorney. "Alex," Tom said, "if they're moving federally verified survey markers without proper documentation, that's a violation of federal law. And if your property has federal boundary verification," he didn't need to finish the sentence. I started documenting everything: trail cameras around the property perimeter, time-stamped photos of every survey marker installation, soil samples from the disturbed ground. My cousin Michael called from Florida, begging me to just take the money and walk away. But this wasn't about money anymore. It was about the crunch of gravel under survey boots that had no business being on my land. It was about the sound of Cindy's heels clicking across courthouse marble during zoning hearings that should never have happened. It was about the bitter taste of courthouse coffee during research sessions that revealed just how deep this corruption went. But most of all, it was about those survey markers. Colonel placed them to teach responsibility and land stewardship. For 50 years, they had been a place where veterans, farmers, and responsible citizens could practice their right to own land free from HOA tyranny. Cindy's crew was turning it into another cookie-cutter development. Here's the thing about boundary covenants in Virginia. They're older than HOA bylaws, older than sustainable development initiatives, and a hell of a lot harder to erase than a survey marker. But you have to know how to fight for them. As I stood there watching another survey truck rumble past my kitchen window, I realized something important. This wasn't going to be won in a courtroom with expensive lawyers and legal briefs. This was going to be won with surveying, strategy, and a little bit of controlled chaos. Cindy decided to turn up the heat. She organized what she called a neighborhood security patrol. 3 HOA board members in matching polo shirts parked at my property entrance like some kind of suburban checkpoint. They photographed every visitor, wrote down license plates, and filed reports with the sheriff about suspicious activity. The harassment campaign was textbook intimidation. There were loud music complaints when I ran my radio during farm work, and citations for my perfectly functional farmhouse that had been standing since 1965, citing unsightly structures and environmental hazards. Reports about my septic system had passed inspection just 6 months earlier. But the real kick in the teeth came when Harold used his county commissioner position to order a wellness check on me through Veteran Services. Apparently, I was a troubled veteran who might be struggling with readjustment issues. The social worker who showed up was apologetic but thorough. She had to check boxes on her clipboard while Cindy watched from her golf cart like she was supervising a military inspection. That's when the coordinated bureaucratic assault began. Building inspector, fire marshal, health department, and animal control all showed up on the same day like some kind of regulatory SWAT team. Each one found minor violations requiring expensive corrections. The building inspector, who happened to be a drinking buddy of Harold's, declared that my front porch needed $6,000 in foundation work. I recognized the squeeze play immediately. It's the same tactic they use in war zones to pressure local officials, overwhelming them with bureaucracy until they give up and cooperate. But two can play that game. While they were drowning me in paperwork, I was making some phone calls of my own. Tom Jenkins at the USGS was very interested to learn that Cindy's HOA had never filed the required boundary verification before moving survey markers. Turns out, any development that moves federally verified survey markers requires federal environmental clearance, even on private property. And the fines for violations start at $30,000 per day. The smell of fresh mulch curing in the spring heat reminded me every morning that I was running out of time. But my research was paying off in ways Cindy never expected. I discovered that their entire Oakwood Estates development had been built in what the USGS classified as a historically significant boundary zone. Insurance companies had initially refused coverage until the HOA provided a boundary verification certificate. Their solution? Permanently move the survey markers and claim the land was always part of their development. Here's your second knowledge nugget. Insurance fraud in development projects often carries criminal penalties, not just civil ones. When developers lie about boundary history to get coverage, that's federal mail fraud. The deeper I dug, the more I realized this wasn't Cindy's first rodeo. Her previous HOA in Richmond had paid a $2.1 million USGS fine for an identical survey marker scheme. She'd left town just ahead of the federal prosecutors and set up shop here in Charlottesville, looking for new victims. Meanwhile, Cindy was spreading rumors about my mental health and violent tendencies. She hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on my military service and organized a petition demanding the county condemn my property as a public nuisance. "We have children playing in these neighborhoods," she told the local paper. "We can't have unstable individuals threatening our safety." But while she was busy playing the victim, I was building alliances. I connected with other HOA victims through online forums and discovered a pattern. Cindy's HOA had absorbed 5 smaller properties through similar tactics over the past 2 years. Each time, the story was the same: pressure, harassment, bureaucratic warfare, and mysterious zoning changes that always seemed to benefit Harold's development company. I partnered with my elderly neighbor, Mr. O'Sullivan, whose family had used kernel survey markers for decades to teach boundary law to local students. I met Jessica Chen, whose family property had been rezoned out of existence by Harold Pembroke 3 years earlier. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic land grab that had been going on for years. The vibration of heavy machinery through my farmhouse floorboards became a daily reminder of what I was fighting for. Every morning, I watched survey trucks rumble past my kitchen window. Every evening, I documented the destruction of kernel survey that was slowly erasing 50 years of family history. But I was also preparing. I installed boundary verification equipment at the survey site and property perimeter. I calculated the exact coordinates of the original survey markers, 12 points that formed the legal boundary of my property. The gritty texture of soil between my fingers as I tested ground composition told the story better than any lawyer could. This wasn't just theft, it was the destruction of historical boundary data on a massive scale. And then I got the certified letter. The county was planning to seize my property through eminent domain for community development. The hearing was scheduled in just 2 weeks. Cindy's quote in the paper made her strategy crystal clear. Sometimes you have to protect the community from itself. But as I stood at my bedroom window that night watching storm clouds gather on the horizon, I realized something important. Those weren't just rain clouds building up. They were opportunity. Cindy went nuclear. Harold fast-tracked an eminent domain hearing scheduled for just 2 weeks out. And suddenly, the HOA was offering me $200,000 for property assessed at $850,000. The message was clear: take the lowball offer or lose everything. The local newspaper ran a hit piece that made me sound like some kind of domestic terrorist. "Troubled Veteran Blocks Community Progress" was the headline, complete with a photo that somehow made my farmhouse look like a militia compound and me look like I hadn't slept in weeks. But Cindy's masterstroke was the photo op. She staged it perfectly. 20 concerned mothers holding children near my property line with a professional photographer capturing their worried faces while my farmhouse loomed menacingly in the background. The Facebook post went viral with the hashtag #ProtectOurKids. "Our children deserve safe neighborhoods," she told the Channel 10 news crew, "not whatever issues he brought back from war." You know what? She was right about one thing. I did bring something back from war. I brought back the ability to recognize when someone's trying to steamroll you with propaganda and the surveying skills to do something about it. Tom Jenkins called with information that changed everything. The USGS had already opened a federal investigation into the boundary marker violations based on my initial complaint. But here's the kicker. Cindy's previous HOA in Richmond faced a $2.1 million fine for the exact same scheme. Federal boundary crimes follow individuals even when they move to new jurisdictions. While Cindy was playing the victim on social media, I was discovering that her entire financial house of cards was built on fraud. The HOA's construction loans were tied to inflated property values, and the banks had required guaranteed boundary verification for loan approval. If those boundary rights reverted back to me, my rightful owner, the entire development would become financially underwater. The taste of bitter irony wasn't lost on me. They'd stolen my boundary to make their land valuable, and now their own greed was going to drown them. Cindy's panic was starting to show. She offered me $450,000 cash, no questions asked, with a 48-hour deadline. When I refused, she flew to Florida to approach my cousin Michael with some sob story about his brother's mental health issues. That backfired spectacularly. Michael might not know Virginia land law, but he knows his cousin. He called me laughing. "Alex, some crazy woman in yoga pants just offered to help with my troubled veteran cousin." I told him if she contacts our family again, I'm calling the FBI. But while Cindy was busy making enemies, I was making allies. I partnered with boundary lawyer Amanda Cross, who specialized in pro bono land rights cases. Together, we formed a coalition with veterans groups who'd been affected by the boundary marker destruction. Jessica Chen brought historical documentation showing her family had used the original survey markers since 1985. Mr. O'Sullivan provided photographs of his students learning boundary law at Colonel's Markers. The local historical society was particularly interested to learn that the survey markers had been used for boundary verification since the Civil War. Turns out, destroying historical boundary markers tends to get federal attention real fast. During my nighttime reconnaissance, old habits from the Army, I discovered something beautiful. Colonel's survey wasn't just a simple boundary line. The original 1971 design included reinforced survey markers that hadn't been fully destroyed by the surveyors. The hollow echo of soil during my midnight tests told me everything I needed to know. The infrastructure was still functional, and it was designed for exactly this situation, restoring the boundary to its original position. I calculated the materials needed to restore the survey markers to operational status: 12 iron pins, 24 survey flags, and 300 linear feet of boundary tape. The HOA signs had only covered a portion of the original boundary line. The math was perfect, but the timing had to be precise. Using my drone for aerial reconnaissance, I mapped the exact locations of those new HOA signs relative to the original boundary markers. 6 signs were built directly on the main boundary line. 3 more had been placed where the corner markers should be. Here's the beautiful part. The survey crews had installed decorative boundary markers using wood chips and decorative stones. They looked pretty, but they weren't designed to handle actual boundary verification. Meanwhile, my original survey markers were engineered specifically for boundary verification and land ownership. Then Cindy made her biggest mistake. Her crew began installing permanent concrete barriers to completely block the original boundary line. This would make my restoration efforts useless and permanently destroy the historical boundary zone. But it also gave me the perfect justification for what I was about to do. The Weather Service was predicting heavy April rains, perfect seasonal cover for emergency boundary restoration. As I stood at those boundary controls at sunset, reading Colonel's journal entry about teaching responsibility through land stewardship, the decision crystallized. Time to restore the boundary. While digging through dusty courthouse records for the third time that week, I found a misfiled document that changed everything. Buried behind a stack of 1972 tax assessments was the original boundary verification covenant from Colonel's survey. The language was beautiful in its simplicity. Boundary operators shall maintain survey markers to preserve historical boundary data and community land ownership education in perpetuity. This wasn't just permission to operate survey markers, it was a legal obligation that superseded any HOA agreements or county ordinances. But Amanda Cross's investigation uncovered something even more damaging. The HOA's insurance applications contained flat-out lies. They'd claimed no boundary history and permanent marker relocation approved by all agencies to secure $40 million in coverage. Here's your third knowledge nugget. Insurance fraud in development projects often carries criminal penalties, not just civil ones. When you lie to insurance companies about boundary history, that's federal mail fraud with mandatory prison time. The deeper we dug, the more the whole scheme unraveled. Harold Pembroke's development company wasn't just the contractor for the HOA project, he was the primary investor. Every HOA sign built on my stolen land put money directly in his pocket. And here's the kicker. He'd never recused himself from a single county commission vote that benefited his project. Tom Jenkins shared USGS findings that made my blood boil. The boundary marker destruction had destroyed decades of historical boundary data that the military had used for research. The Army Historical Preservation Office had documented the survey's significance, but somehow the report got lost in Harold's office before it could trigger federal prosecution. They weren't just stealing land, they were destroying historical military data. But the real smoking gun came from Amanda's banking contacts. The construction loans were secured by fraudulent environmental assessments that claimed the boundary marker relocation was a temporary construction measure. Banks were told the boundary would be restored once construction was complete. If those boundary rights reverted to me, the entire development would violate federal lending regulations. The banks could demand immediate full repayment of $10 million in construction loans. That's when I found Colonel's handwritten journals in the farmhouse attic. His 1985 entry broke my heart. Ran the boundary law program today. Helped 3 kids earn their surveying certifications. That's what community is about. The survey markers were never about our family's profit. It was about community service. Teaching responsibility, land stewardship, and safety to the next generation. Reading those journals, I realized what Cindy had really stolen. It wasn't just land or a boundary, it was 50 years of community education that my great-grandfather had built one student at a time. My surveying analysis confirmed what I'd suspected. Cindy's boundary layout was creating a safety hazard. During community events, people would be standing directly in the original boundary line. The original survey markers had provided natural safety barriers for the entire community, and my restored boundary would be the only way to safely manage land ownership. The timeline pressure was crushing. April rains were predicted to be the heaviest in 5 years. If I waited for the legal system to grind through appeals and federal investigations, natural erosion would happen anyway, potentially causing real property damage. But if I acted now, I could control the timing and intensity. A controlled boundary restoration would demonstrate proper land ownership without endangering anyone, while proving that the HOA development violated federal environmental law. The musty smell of old survey equipment reminded me that this infrastructure was built to last. Colonel had designed it for exactly this moment, when someone would need to stand up for the boundary and the community that depended on it. As storm clouds gathered on the horizon, I made the decision that would change everything. Time to honor Colonel's legacy and restore that boundary. You don't just restore a boundary without a plan. This wasn't revenge. It was a military operation with legal cover, historical justification, and community support. First, I assembled my team. Amanda Cross coordinated the legal strategy, filing additional federal complaints to ensure maximum media attention when the boundary restored. Tom Jenkins provided federal cover, guaranteeing that USGS investigators would witness what he called our historical boundary demonstration. Jessica Chen documented 30 years of community boundary programs, providing historical testimony about survey operations that proved the HOA sign conversion was destroying generational land ownership education. Mr. O'Sullivan offered his property as a staging area and brought credibility as the community's most respected longtime resident. Amanda's legal strategy was brilliant. She filed an emergency land ownership restoration motion, arguing that the boundary covenant legally required me to maintain historical survey markers for community education. We weren't breaking the law, we were following it. Here's a crucial knowledge nugget. Historical boundary rights often supersede residential development rights, especially when you have historical documentation proving prior use. The key is having ironclad paperwork that predates any development claims. My technical preparation was pure Army Corps surveying. I created detailed boundary restoration plans with precise calculations, controlled setup starting at 6 a.m., gradual implementation over 4 hours, peak operations at 10 a.m. The equipment was calculated to demonstrate proper land ownership without causing structural damage to anything except Cindy's illegal HOA signs. Safety was paramount. I posted warning signs 24 hours in advance and personally notified the volunteer fire department. This wasn't some reckless boundary operation. It was a carefully controlled demonstration of how land ownership naturally should be conducted. Amanda contacted environmental reporters from the Charlottesville Daily Progress and local TV stations. Jessica arranged for community members to witness the land ownership restoration. The strategy was simple: control the narrative before Cindy could spin it as dangerous veteran terrorizes neighborhood. Our intelligence network was straight out of a spy novel. Mr. O'Sullivan monitored HOA activity through the neighborhood gossip network. Never underestimate little old ladies with time on their hands. The local coffee shop barista, who happened to be Jessica's cousin, reported on county commission closed-door meetings. My Army buddy at Fort Lee provided surveillance drone support for legal documentation. While I was rebuilding boundary infrastructure with modern safety systems, Amanda was waging financial warfare. She contacted insurance companies with evidence of fraudulent applications, arranged for banking regulators to review construction loan documentation, and prepared whistleblower complaints about Harold's conflicts of interest. The beauty was in the timing coordination. The Weather Service confirmed heavy rains in 72 hours. Amanda scheduled federal environmental inspection for the same week. Jessica arranged for the Historical Preservation Office to document boundary operations. A perfect storm of natural weather, federal oversight, and community support, all converging at exactly the right moment. But I knew Cindy's psychology. She always escalated when pressured, so I prepared for her predictable responses. Emergency HOA meeting, media smear campaign, probably a restraining order filed through her corrupt judge friend. Amanda drafted preemptive legal responses to each expected attack. The evidence preservation was crucial. I compiled comprehensive photo documentation of the current HOA sign conversion, recorded video testimony from affected veterans and neighbors, and gathered historical photographs showing the original boundary markers and safety operations. Amanda secured everything in federal court filings for legal protection. Safety protocols included coordination with the volunteer fire department, communication with neighboring residents, and detailed notices posted in English and Spanish. I even created an evacuation plan we wouldn't need just to demonstrate responsible management. The economic warfare was Amanda's specialty. She tipped off state banking regulators about construction loan irregularities, contacted the Virginia Attorney General about insurance fraud evidence, and prepared a civil RICO lawsuit alleging a pattern of racketeering. Here's another knowledge nugget. Coordinated regulatory pressure often forces settlement faster than individual lawsuits. When multiple agencies investigate simultaneously, defendants can't fight on all fronts. The smell of WD-40 and machine oil filled the evening air as I serviced all the equipment and tested boundary safety systems under minimal operation. Everything worked perfectly. Colonel had built this system to last. I stocked the farmhouse with supplies for a potential siege, knowing Cindy would try everything to stop me. Amanda filed protective court orders preventing interference with lawful boundary operations. We established secure communications using military-grade encrypted radio. As I stood at those controls for the final equipment check, watching storm clouds build on the horizon, everything felt aligned. The weather forecast confirmed heavy rains in 48 hours. Federal investigators would arrive in 36 hours. Cindy was scheduled for her morning show appearance in 24 hours, probably planning another attack on my character. The timing was perfect. Dawn tomorrow would bring justice and 50 years of stolen land ownership back to where it belonged. Cindy's desperation reached new levels when she hired private security to patrol my property perimeter. These weren't just rent-a-cops with flashlights. These were the same tactical gear wannabes who work private military contracts and think HOA disputes are combat zones. My trail cameras caught them red-handed trying to sabotage the boundary safety systems at 2 a.m. One genius was caught on video attempting to pour concrete mix into the survey markers while his buddy served as lookout. Tom Jenkins had tipped off the sheriff's department, and Deputy Miller was waiting in the shadows when they made their move. The arrest was beautiful. Mr. Tactical Vest claimed they were protecting community infrastructure from an unstable individual, but it's hard to explain why you're carrying a bag of quickset concrete at 2 o'clock in the morning. Cindy's media blitz was even more desperate. She appeared on the Charlottesville morning show wearing her Sunday best and speaking in that trembling voice politicians use when they want to look like victims. Veterans need mental health support, not weapons, she told the host, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. This man learned to use surveying as a weapon in Ukraine, and now he's threatening to turn our community into a war zone. Harold provided expert testimony as a county planner about catastrophic boundary safety risks, conveniently forgetting to mention that my boundary had passed every safety inspection for 50 years. But while Cindy was playing victim on television, my surveillance training was paying dividends. I documented every sabotage attempt, every illegal entry, every piece of evidence that would later prove criminal conspiracy. Tom revealed that federal investigators had been wiretapping Harold's office phone as part of an ongoing corruption probe. These people were more desperate than I'd realized. The legal assault came next. Harold fast-tracked an emergency restraining order hearing for 6 a.m. the following morning, clearly hoping to catch us off guard. Judge Robert Shaw, Harold's golf buddy, who'd received $10,000 in campaign contributions from Harold's development company, agreed to hear the emergency public safety motion. Amanda discovered the corruption connection and immediately filed for Shaw's recusal, but we knew the fix was in. If they couldn't stop the boundary restoration legally, they'd stop it through a corrupt judge. Meanwhile, Cindy organized a neighborhood wellness patrol to physically surround my property. 20 HOA residents showed up with folding chairs, coolers, and "Protect Our Kids" signs, planning to live stream the boundary restoration as environmental terrorism. The optics were perfect for her narrative: suburban families with children versus a dangerous veteran with a boundary system. But Jessica Chen had been busy too. She brought 30 veterans and families to support what we called land ownership restoration. Mr. O'Sullivan organized a counter-demonstration with historical photos showing the boundary in its natural state. Amanda arranged for Historical Preservation Society and Veterans Group representatives to attend. Two competing narratives were about to collide: veteran attacks families versus community protecting historical land ownership rights. The technical sabotage escalated when security footage revealed someone had poured concrete mix into the boundary markers overnight, creating a blockage designed to cause actual safety hazards if I restored operations. This wasn't just harassment, it was attempted murder disguised as vandalism. I worked through the night with a portable jackhammer, clearing the sabotage while documenting every chunk of concrete as evidence. The metallic taste of exhaustion mixed with fury as I realized how far they were willing to go. Harold used his county commission emergency powers to declare my property an imminent public hazard, authorizing the fire department to secure the dangerous boundary infrastructure. Fire Chief Reynolds, one of the few honest officials left in town, privately warned me that this was purely political. "Alex, you've got maybe 6 hours before they force me to intervene," he said. "Make it count." The insurance investigation breakthrough came at the perfect moment. Amanda's fraud reports triggered a state investigation, and the Virginia Insurance Commission froze all HOA development insurance policies. Without valid insurance, the construction company faced immediate work stoppage. Financial pressure was finally hitting where it hurt: Cindy and Harold's wallets. Tom moved the USGS inspection up 24 hours due to credible sabotage reports. Federal agents were now en route, arriving at 8 a.m. If the boundary restored during their inspection, it would become federal evidence of proper land ownership. But Cindy's final gambit was the cruelest. She contacted Veterans Mental Health Services, claiming I'd made suicide threats and needed an involuntary psychiatric hold. The VA social worker arrived at my farmhouse at 5:30 a.m., just as I was preparing for the boundary restoration. I had to convince her I was mentally competent while simultaneously preparing to restore a boundary. Not exactly a normal Tuesday morning conversation. Michael called from Florida, his voice breaking. "I can't lose my cousin too. Please, Alex, this isn't what Colonel would want." For a moment, I almost cracked. Then I found Colonel's final journal entry about standing up to bullies, and my resolve hardened like concrete. Sometimes you have to restore the boundary to save the community. At 7:02 a.m., with federal agents watching and the morning sun painting the sky orange, I began restoring the boundary to 25% capacity. The sound was magnificent. Not the violent rush of destruction, but the gentle whisper of soil being moved back to its original position. For the first time in 18 months, the boundary began operating in its original layout, exactly where history intended. Jessica Chen knelt beside the restored marker and cupped the soil in her weathered hands, tears streaming down her face. "This is the boundary where my grandfather taught me about land ownership," she whispered. Cindy's reaction was immediate and predictable. She screamed at the federal agents to arrest the terrorist, her carefully composed morning show demeanor cracking like cheap paint. USGS agent Lisa Chen calmly explained, "Ma'am, this gentleman has the legal right to operate his historical boundary system." But Cindy was live streaming on Facebook, her voice rising to near hysteria. "He's turning our community into a war zone. This is what happens when we let unstable veterans have weapons." Except the boundary wasn't threatening anything. It was operating exactly where it belonged, in the original layout that her development had illegally blocked. Local news helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the boundary restoration live. The Charlottesville Daily Progress reporter was interviewing veterans about their restored access to land ownership when Cindy tried to hijack the interview. "This veteran is using military training to attack civilians," she shrieked. The reporter, clearly confused, asked, "Ma'am, the boundary is operating in its original layout. How exactly is this an attack?" You could almost hear Cindy's narrative collapsing in real time. Harold was frantically calling Judge Shaw, screaming into his phone about property values and campaign contributions. "That psycho is destroying millions in property value," he yelled, apparently forgetting that Amanda was recording the conversation from the courthouse steps. Here's a legal nugget for you. Virginia is a two-party consent state, which means you need both parties' permission to record a phone conversation. But when one party is a federal investigator, different rules apply. The surveying validation was beautiful. USGS Agent Chen measured the boundary operations and confirmed it matched historical safety patterns exactly. Tom Jenkins documented everything. This is how the boundary operated naturally before the 2024 destruction. Federal agencies prioritize historical land ownership over development convenience, and we were proving that principle in real time. Mr. O'Sullivan's son's boundary program resumed for the first time in 18 months. 3 veteran groups reported restored access to their training facilities. The local coffee shop owner brought coffee and homemade pastries to everyone, saying, "My daddy was a soldier. This is how it should be." Even some of Cindy's supporters began quietly leaving as they realized no homes were actually threatened. Turns out it's hard to maintain righteous indignation when the disaster you're protesting is just a boundary operating where it legally belongs. The insurance collapse accelerated when the construction company received a cease and desist order from state investigators. All work stopped on the HOA development pending the fraud investigation. Cindy discovered her own homeowner's insurance might be voided due to fraudulent land use claims. The financial house of cards was collapsing faster than a sandcastle in a storm. But Cindy wasn't done fighting. She called Harold in a panic. "Get your trucks down here and block that boundary." Harold, apparently having learned nothing from the arrest of his security team, sent 3 landscaping trucks to accidentally spill their loads across the boundary layout. Federal agents immediately arrested the truck drivers for interfering with a federal environmental investigation. Turns out, interfering with federal historical preservation enforcement is a felony, not a civil matter. The technical success was everything I'd calculated. Boundary operations stabilized at optimal levels for historical ownership and community education. No safety hazards to residential areas. The boundary stayed within its natural safety parameters exactly as 50 years of historical operations had proven it would. My Army Corps surveying had been perfect. The political fallout was swift. County Commissioner Reynolds arrived and publicly demanded Harold's immediate resignation. "This corruption has made our county a laughingstock," he announced to the gathered media. "You're done." Federal investigators expanded their probe to include RICO charges for systematic land fraud. Tom told me later, "This is the smoking gun we needed for criminal prosecution." But the sweetest moment came when Cindy realized her $2.1 million investment was now worthless without fraudulent land use claims. She screamed at me across the boundary, "You've destroyed everything! 30 families!" My response was calm, measured, and loud enough for every camera to catch. "No, ma'am, I restored everything. Your families can use the boundary legally just like everyone else has to." Cindy stormed off, threatening federal lawsuits that would never materialize. As Jessica's extended family arrived with homemade chili and cold beer, and Mr. O'Sullivan brought a traditional Irish whiskey to bless the restored boundary, I realized something important. This was never about revenge. It was about community. The kind colonel had built one neighbor at a time, one boundary lesson at a time, one act of responsibility at a time. The media narrative had shifted completely. Historical preservation groups hailed the boundary restoration as a model for historical site restoration. The original veteran boundary story became community reclaiming stolen historical space. Sometimes the truth flows as naturally as soil finding its way home. Judge Shaw's courtroom at 2 p.m. was packed tighter than a can of sardines. Media crews, veterans, HOA residents, and federal agents filled every seat, with overflow crowds watching through the windows. You could feel the electricity in the air. This wasn't just a legal hearing. It was a community reckoning. Cindy arrived with a three-piece suit army, high-powered Richmond attorneys, expert witnesses, and enough legal firepower to take down a small government. She traded her yoga pants for a conservative black dress and pearls, playing the role of concerned community leader defending innocent families. I showed up with Amanda wearing a simple button-down shirt and Colonel's old cowboy hat. Sometimes the best armor is just being comfortable in your own skin. The gallery was divided like a wedding gone wrong. HOA supporters on the left clutching their "Protect Our Kids" signs, forming community on the right with weathered hands and determined faces. Cindy's attorney opened with dramatic flair, presenting photos of damaged boundary markers and claiming $1.8 million in emotional distress from my boundary restoration. They wheeled in a psychiatrist who'd never met me but was happy to diagnose combat revenge fantasies based on newspaper clippings. "Your Honor," the attorney declared, gesturing toward me like I was a war criminal, "this disturbed veteran is using military surveying knowledge to terrorize innocent families. He's turned land ownership into a weapon of mass destruction." The courtroom buzzed with whispers until Amanda stood for our response. She presented the 1971 Historical Boundary Covenant that legally required boundary operations. USGS Agent Chen took the stand and testified that my boundary restoration had restored historical operations without causing any actual property damage. Historical photographs proved current operations matched 50 years of natural historical patterns. Here's your final knowledge nugget. Legal land ownership documentation always trumps recent development claims, especially when you have federal environmental agencies backing your position. Then Tom Jenkins took the stand as USGS enforcement officer. His testimony was devastating. The HOA development had violated 3 separate federal historical preservation laws, committed systematic insurance fraud, and destroyed historical military data. Judge Shaw squirmed in his seat as federal crimes were detailed in his courtroom. You could see him calculating whether his political loyalty to Harold was worth potential federal prosecution for obstruction of justice. The breaking point came when Amanda called Harold as a witness. Under oath, he admitted to fast-tracking zoning changes while I was deployed overseas and revealed his financial stake in the development company. When Amanda played the recorded phone conversation about destroying property values, Harold exploded. "This is a federal setup," he screamed, storming toward the exit. "We did nothing wrong." His own words captured on audio proved the conspiracy better than any prosecutor could. But the real emotional power came from community testimony. Jessica Chen described 3 generations of land ownership destroyed by the boundary marker destruction. Her voice broke as she talked about her grandfather's dreams dying with the stolen boundary. Mr. O'Sullivan showed photographs of his son's boundary awards, earned at Colonel's markers, brown and withered after the destruction. His quiet dignity spoke louder than any legal argument. Fire Chief Reynolds testified that the boundary restoration was professionally executed with 0 safety violations. Neighboring property owners confirmed their historical land ownership had been fully restored. Then Cindy took the stand for what became her final performance. "He came back from war damaged, Your Honor," she said, pointing at me with trembling fingers. "He's taking revenge on innocent families using psychological warfare against children." She claimed I'd threatened her safety and described the boundary restoration as environmental terrorism designed to destroy property values and traumatize residents. When Amanda called me to testify, the courtroom went silent. I presented Colonel's journals documenting 50 years of community land ownership education, explained my Army Corps surveying calculations, and spoke directly to Judge Shaw. Your Honor, I didn't threaten anyone. I restored a historical boundary facility that was stolen from my family in this community for 50 years. The mic drop moment came when Amanda presented final evidence, documentation of Cindy's Richmond HOA paying $2.1 million in USGS fines for an identical boundary marker scheme. The federal prosecutor stood and announced a criminal investigation into interstate historical site fraud conspiracy. The courtroom erupted as the scope of the corruption became clear. Judge Shaw had no choice. He denied all restraining order requests, ruled that my boundary restoration was legal and beneficial, and ordered the HOA to cease all interference with federal historical preservation investigations. His warning to Harold was pointed. This court will not obstruct lawful federal historical preservation enforcement. As federal agents escorted Harold from the courthouse while banking investigators served additional warrants, Cindy found herself surrounded by reporters with nowhere to hide. She refused all comment and sped away in her Mercedes, probably already calling moving companies. I emerged to cheering crowds of veterans, historical preservationists, and curious townspeople who'd witnessed justice flowing as naturally as soil finding its way home. Amanda announced the federal RICO investigation at an impromptu press conference, while Jessica thanked me on behalf of every affected family. My statement was simple. This was never about revenge. It was about doing right by the land and the people who depend on it. 3 days after Cindy sued me for living outside her HOA, I had legally dismantled her entire empire. 6 months later, justice flowed as naturally as the restored boundary operations. Harold Pembroke pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy charges and got 2 years in federal prison. Cindy faced $6.8 million in civil penalties and filed for bankruptcy faster than soil rushing through an open boundary. The development company paid $8.5 million in USGS fines and got banned from all federal contract work. The HOA dissolved completely, and residents formed a new community association focused on historical preservation instead of suburban tyranny. My property value was restored to $1 million after the federal historical designation made it more valuable than any suburban development could. The $250,000 settlement from the insurance fraud investigation went to a good cause. I bought Jessica's family property at tax auction and returned it to her debt-free. Historical preservation often increases property values more than development ever could. The community transformation was the real victory. The restored boundary now attracts historical tourism, competitive surveying, and land ownership education where HOA signs were supposed to stand. Mr. O'Sullivan's son's boundary program became a demonstration site for responsible land ownership education. 3 veteran groups reported their best training results in a decade. The local coffee shop became the unofficial headquarters for the Charlottesville Boundary Historical Association, where veterans and historical preservationists planned the next fight against corporate historical site destruction. The historical success exceeded every expectation. Military historians documented the boundary's significance to land ownership during the Civil War. The Historical Preservation Society documented 10 historical markers being restored to their original condition. The Army Historical Preservation Office designated the boundary as a critical historical site, ensuring permanent protection. My boundary restoration became a case study in the Army Corps' training manual. Sometimes the best revenge is just doing your job correctly. Personally, I found peace I didn't know I was missing. I renovated Colonel's farmhouse using sustainable construction techniques, and Michael moved back from Florida to help manage our growing historical tourism business. Amanda and I, well, let's just say fighting historical preservation crime together creates a pretty strong bond. The ripple effect spread across Virginia like soil finding new channels. Historical preservation groups use the Charlottesville boundary model to challenge illegal historical site destruction statewide. Federal agencies cite our case in new historical preservation enforcement guidelines. I've become an unofficial consultant for communities fighting HOA overreach, and the phone rings constantly. We established the Colonel Reynolds Historical Land Ownership Scholarship for rural students studying historical preservation. Jessica's daughter, Emily, was the first recipient, and she's now studying historical preservation at UVA. She wants to protect historical sites across Virginia from people like Cindy. The annual Boundary Days Festival celebrates restoration and community resilience with local food, historical education, and veteran support services. We raised money for a historical preservation legal defense fund that's already helped 3 other communities fight back against corporate theft. My favorite part is kids learning land stewardship on the boundary, where HOA signs were supposed to be built, learning responsibility where homes were supposed to stand. Every Sunday, I visit Colonel's grave and bring a handful of soil from the boundary, just like he used to do when he checked the safety barriers after heavy rains. "Thanks, Colonel," I tell him. "The boundary is singing again, just like you said it would." The Legacy Project ensures this victory lasts forever. The Charlottesville Boundary Historical Trust now owns development rights to the entire historical site, creating a permanent buffer zone that prevents future commercial development. No one will ever steal this historical space again. But here's the beautiful twist. Cindy's Richmond HOA faced federal RICO prosecution based on our case. 75 families across 2 states filed similar historical preservation lawsuits. What started as one veterans' fight became a movement for historical justice nationwide. From my porch each evening, watching that boundary operate exactly where it belongs, I'm reminded that some fights are worth everything you've got. Sometimes you have to restore the boundary to save the community, but you don't do it alone. You do it with your community, your neighbors, and people who believe historical preservation belongs to everyone, not just whoever has the best lawyers and the most corrupt county commission connections. If you're fighting HOA overreach, historical destruction, or bureaucratic bullying, don't give up. Document everything. Find allies. And remember, the law is on your side when you're protecting the land for future generations. Drop a comment and tell me your HOA nightmare story. I read every single one and reply when I can, because these fights are easier when we support each other. Hit subscribe if you want more stories about communities fighting back against corruption and winning. And remember, your voice matters, your vote matters, and your historical sites matter too. History finds a way, justice finds a way, and communities that fight together win together. Charlottesville Boundary operates freely, y'all, and it always will.